Hello and welcome to this Mythconceptions podcast from NET English. Today we're going to focus on an Inspector Calls and this idea that Gerald in the play was just trying to help. Now the mythconception we're going to try and tease out today is some sort of variation of one of these three things. Firstly, that in terms of Eva Smith, or Daisy Renton as he knew her, Gerald did nothing wrong. Or that his actions towards Eva Smith, Daisy Renton, are entirely defensible. Or thirdly, simply, that Gerald was just trying to help. As ever, we're going to test these ideas, look at the evidence and the arguments for and against, and try and draw some sort of reasoned conclusion. So what are the arguments for? Why would someone have these views? Now, there's quite a few reasons why. So firstly, Gerald rescues Eva Smith, Daisy Renton as he knew her, in the bar from the apparently quite unwelcome attentions of Alderman Joe Meggerty. And there's a few quotations around that are useful. She was young and fresh and charming, she was altogether out of place, that old Joe Meggerty, half drunk and goggle-eyed, had wedged her into a corner with that obscene fat carcass of his. So Gerald fundamentally rescued her. Secondly, she asked him for help. As he tells us, she gave me a glance that was nothing less than a cry for help. So actually, rather than him initiating it, she reached out to him. A third reason might well be that she was hungry, and Gerald fed her. He provided her with food. And he says, at that moment she was actually hungry. I made the people at the county, this hotel, find some food for her. So she was hungry, he fed her. In fact, more than that, she was about to be homeless, and Gerald gave her somewhere to live. She was going to be turned out the miserable back room that she had, and as he says, I insisted on Daisy moving into those rooms that belonged to his friend who'd gone on holiday. She was poor, and Gerald provided her with money. So she hadn't a penny, we're told. I made her take some money. So actually, she's hungry, homeless, and poor, and Gerald gives her food, gives her somewhere to live, and gives her money. Now, Gerald is very, very clear that he was simply trying to help. As he says, I didn't install her there so that I could make love to her. Now, of course, at the time, make love to simply means to pursue, to woo, to attempt to get with, I suppose, would be a common modern way of putting it, rather than simply meaning sex. Now, his relationship with Eva was consensual, it seems. Gerald didn't, at least in theory, coerce Eva Smith or Daisy Renton into any kind of relationship or sexual activity. And there does appear to have been some sort of mutual affection. As Gerald says, I didn't ask for anything in return. She was young and pretty and warm-hearted and intensely grateful, so she appears to have more or less offered herself to him. And as he puts it, I didn't feel about her as she felt about me. So Eva Smith, Daisy Renton, does appear to have had feelings for Gerald. There's also the argument that when he's confronted, Gerald does admit what happened. And in fact, he even defends that relationship to Mrs. Burling. And he says to her very clearly, it wasn't disgusting. There is an argument, of course, that Daisy, for one thing, didn't take her own life until quite some time after her relationship with Gerald. And Gerald does seem genuinely quite upset when he realises what happened to Eva, to Daisy. As he puts it, she didn't blame me at all. I wish to God she had now. And I'm rather more upset by this business than I probably appear. There does appear to be emotional impact on Gerald. There's also the idea that both Sheila and the inspector seem at least partially to forgive Gerald. As Sheila puts it, I rather respect you more than I've ever done before. And even the inspector, who, remember, of course, in the play is Priestley's mouthpiece, says that Gerald at least had some affection for her and made her happy for a time. In a sense, what we get from Gerald, at least provided by his narrative, is, as we're given, this idea of him being the hero, or as Sheila, mockingly to be fair, puts it, the wonderful fairy prince. Now, in fact, there's actually a second batch of reasons also why some students had this idea that what Gerald does is acceptable. And these, in some ways, are actually much more problematic. One is actually simply dismissed as being a prostitute. Daisy Renton, the name, of course, gives us several clues as to that. The fact that she's in this bar, which is a favourite haunt of women of the town. So there are indications, potentially, of prostitution here. So Gerald has sex with a prostitute. What's the big deal, of course? That's her job, is the way that some students would view that. In fact, one conclusion students do sometimes draw is that they both got what they wanted. So Gerald got sex, and Eva or Daisy got money, somewhere to live, food, etc. There's also this pervasive idea we see in the play, and also from some modern interpretations, that Gerald's behaviour and this relational dynamic is seen as normal or defensible or even acceptable for middle and upper class men who frequent the bar, as Gerald does, and who act as Gerald did. So quotations such as, "You must understand that a lot of young men, as Mr. Burling says, these fat old tarts around the town, Eric tells us, the ones I see some of your respectable friends with." Clearly, this is very, very commonplace. It's very widespread among people like Mr. Burling, his friends, Eric, Gerald, and so on. In actual fact, even Gerald seems to view this as simply a normal thing for a man to do, just part of being a man. As he puts it, nearly any man would have done. So this pervasive idea that this sort of exploitation of women for the sexual pleasure of men is simply a normal thing at the time and an acceptable thing. Right, so what are the counter-arguments? Well, there's even more of these. So firstly, Gerald's idea that he simply drops into a bar on the way home is something that's worth unpacking a little bit. He's visiting a bar that is notorious for prostitution. It's a favourite haunt of women of the town, we're told. So Gerald is deliberately visiting places that are notorious for prostitution and that all the other men in the play seem to know about. So this idea of innocently dropping into this bar seems a little bit dodgy. Gerald rescues Eva Smith, not because she needs help, but because she looks vulnerable and she's attractive. So he dismisses those hard-eyed, dough-faced women in the bar and helps the one who looks young and fresh and charming. So Gerald's behaviour immediately is objectifying Eva Smith, Daisy Renton, whichever, and it's predatory. So where are all the other needy, helpless women that Gerald supports and rescues? Well, there aren't any. He rejects all the prostitutes, helps the one that looks vulnerable, and then exploits her weakness. This is not an innocent act. In fact, Gerald is disgusted by the established prostitutes in the bar. As he says, "I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women." That's a really strong rejection from Gerald. This veneer of social acceptability and charm that he exhibits elsewhere in the place has slipped there. This is the real Gerald we're seeing. And what we're shown is his prejudice and his snobbery. And it's also important to recognise that these women in the bar, these prostitutes, are hard-eyed and dough-faced because of men like him. They are there because of men like him, and they're like that because of the way they've been treated by men like him. Notice, of course, that Gerald takes the one woman in the bar who doesn't look like a prostitute. She's quite different, he said. She looked out of place down there. And what he does is he treats her like one, or at least turns her into one, perhaps. He takes her, he pays her money, he uses her for sex, and then gets rid of her when he's bored. Now, notice where Gerald takes Eva Smith after the bar. He takes her to a hotel. Now, that could be innocent, and that's certainly the way that he spins it. It's a place where there is alcohol, there is food, it's comfortable, it's somewhere they can talk, right? But hotels also have bedrooms. And notice also that the first thing he does at this hotel is he buys her alcohol. And alcohol in the play is this broader symbol of corruption, of influence, port and lemonade, as he puts it. Now, Gerald also arranges a second meeting. So the first one we might dismiss as simply chance. The second time, it's a deliberate thing. And as he tells us, we met again, not accidentally this time. So Gerald, in fact, plans to meet Eva Smith. He plans to meet Daisy Renton. This is not a surprise and not an accident. It is also important to remember that Gerald, as we know in the play, is being unfaithful to Sheila. So, as we're told right from near the start, "Last summer when you never came near me," as Sheila tells us, and as she calls herself the girl he's supposed to be in love with. Gerald is supposed to be not simply with Sheila, but getting married to Sheila at some point, right? He's proposed, very, very recently, and gives her the ring in the play. This is not the actions of someone who's like that. There's a double standard here, an immorality, a deceptiveness to Gerald. He also tries, notice it here, to cover up what he did. He tries to convince Sheila to lie for him. As he puts it, "For God's sake, don't say anything to the inspector." He orders Sheila, effectively, to lie to the police inspector to cover up what he has done. So it's really, really clear that he does not care as much for Sheila as he does for himself. His focus is entirely self-interested. And notice that she tries repeatedly to dictate and to control Sheila's behaviour. As he says, she ought to be excused. She's had about as much as she can stand. He has this patronising, authoritarian, patriarchal view of how he's allowed to behave towards her, and this assumption that she should simply be obedient and know her place. And there's more. Gerald's relationship with Eva Smith is based entirely on this fundamental power imbalance. She's intensely grateful, we're told. I became at once the most important person in her life. So Gerald benefits not simply from sexual pleasure, but also the power boost that it gives him, the ego boost that it gives him. And it's a power imbalance that he deliberately and consciously maintains. As he tells us, she lived very economically on what had allowed her. He gives her enough money to keep her going. He allows her some money, almost the way you give pocket money to a young person. But notice the thing he doesn't give her. Gerald, remember, is part of a family that owns a factory. He's involved in the running of that factory. He could have given her a job, helped support her, give her independence, a chance to find her feet, and he doesn't because he likes having her dependent on him. Now, that dependency is not simply about money. Gerald also knows that there's an emotional imbalance here. As he tells us, I didn't feel about her as she felt about me. And he seems perfectly happy to exploit that imbalance. He also doesn't accept any responsibility. As he puts it, it was inevitable. Inevitable, of course, means it was not his fault. Of course it was going to happen. It's not his fault that it did. He says nearly any man would have done. So again, he's abdicating responsibility. All men would have done the same thing. He even passes the blame partially onto her, or some accountability responsibility onto Eva Smith, Daisy Renton. She knew it couldn't last, so not his fault that it didn't. She hadn't expected it to last. Again, not his fault that it ended. Notice that he ends that relationship, and it is a relationship note because it's an extended period of time that this happens over. He ends it when it becomes inconvenient for him. I had to go away for several weeks, so he just stops it, cuts it off, takes away everything that is given her, the place that she's living, the relationship, the money, all of it. He also fails to learn from the experience. I met a police sergeant I know down the road, he tells us. So he leaves the house and immediately asks about what's going on. This is not someone who's so distraught they have to go and recover their emotional stability. This is someone looking for an out. And then at the end, when he says to Sheila, everything's all right now, Sheila, what about this ring? He learns nothing interpersonally, socially, emotionally at all. And there is this fundamental idea that Gerald, in a sense, has a much, much larger emotional impact on Eva Smith than any other character. She's fired from jobs, she's sacked, she's isolated, rejected. But Gerald is the one, actually, where it's a personal thing, over an extended period of time, a real relationship that he offers her. He gives her a middle-class lifestyle, a loving partner or an apparently loving partner, money, stability, interest, treats like a human being. And then by ending that relationship, he takes away everything that she has, deliberately and consciously kept dependent and then completely rejected. So, where does this leave us in terms of these mythconceptions? Well, unsurprisingly, these are a fundamental misunderstanding of the narrative. This is certainly the narrative that Gerald attempts to offer us, that he did nothing wrong, that his actions are defensible, that he was simply trying to help, and that nothing that happened is his fault, and he can't be blamed for what happened. And Gerald, of course, is very charming. He is that easy, well-bred young man about town. So what we have in the play is Gerald essentially weaving this socially acceptable narrative in which he rescued a vulnerable young girl from a bar, he fed her, gave her somewhere to live, gave her money, and accidentally ended up having a relationship with her, but it was all her and she knew it couldn't work. And instead what we then have in the play revealed is this counter-narrative in which Gerald visits a bar frequented by prostitutes that he clearly knows well. He picks up a vulnerable young woman that he takes to a hotel, plies with alcohol, sets her up in his friend's apartment, takes absolute control over her entire life, and ensures her absolute dependence on him. He takes advantage of her naivety and her emotional dependence, and he breaks it off when it becomes inconvenient for him and tries essentially to pay her off. He repeatedly lies about her. He gaslights his girlfriend, his fiancée, and he even tries to encourage others to lie as well. And he seems to believe that what he did doesn't matter as long as it's not public knowledge. Gerald, in a sense, has a greater emotional, personal, and long-term impact than any other character. He takes a woman who has been independent, and he consciously and deliberately makes her passive and dependent on him. He exploits her for his own selfish desires, his own gains, his own pleasure, and he seems completely oblivious to the impact of his actions. Gerald represents very clearly what we would now see as the sense of entitlement and this toxic masculinity in its worst possible sense. And it's also noticeable, I think, that Gerald's behaviour almost seems worse from a modern point of view than for an original audience. Gerald, if we had to summarise what he is in the play, is emblematic, I think, of the self-propagating cycle of patriarchal oppression and exploitation, and his attempt at the end of the play to reassert the norms that he's used to at the start, that are established at the start, are based on the idea that this is a system that serves the interests and the desires of Gerald and those like him. So there we have it, a discussion around this idea that Gerald was simply trying to help, and I think our conclusion very clearly is that doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. Thank you very much for your time today. As ever, remember, with all these ideas, consider them yourselves. Debate them, think about them, discuss them, write about them, and do draw your own conclusions. But hopefully that's been useful, and I'll see you in the next one of these that we do.